Thanks, John. I'm used to being called Cloud by most, Mr. Cloud by most telemarketers, so this is the one time it would probably be appropriate. I'm going to invite our panelists to join us at the table. And as they're doing so, I'm going to do some brief introductions. John did mine. I'm the Director of National Security Solutions, Operating Unit Northrop Grumman, focusing on system modernization for a lot of our federal civilian national security customers. What John didn't know is that I'm a tech fellow emeritus primarily because of interest in cloud computing. And so I'm thrilled to be up here with this esteemed panel. So for some brief intros then, first on my immediate left, we have Shannon Silverstein. Shannon leads the DHS and Department of Justice portfolio at Cloudera Government Solutions, where she's assisting those customers with leading big data initiatives and transformation to cloud computing. Next to Shannon then in the middle is Mr. Jonathan Album, and he's Public Sector CTO or Chief Technology Officer at Veritas Technologies, where he guides his team and federal customers in implementing multi-cloud data management, data protection, and storage optimization solutions. Prior to joining the private sector, Jonathan was also CIO at the USDA, where he led IT modernization efforts. And then finally, Jay Hajir. You're going to hear more from Jay shortly this afternoon as well for an additional session. But Jay is CEO of Practical Solutions, where he has led IT modernization and cloud adoption for federal clients, including the Small Business Administration, and that'll be the specific topic of the next session as well. So with that, I'm going to try to put us on sort of a rapid pace here, only because I really want to make sure that we're able to cover questions from the audience and questions from the 800 or 900 folks online. And so I'm going to tee it up with a quick question to maybe start things off. I will be the first to admit that we are all guilty of lots and lots of acronyms and terms that we use. We don't always know what they mean, but we especially appreciate that maybe everybody in the audience doesn't know that. So if you hear us getting on the wrong side of an acronym, shoot your hand up. That'll be my cue to pause us and get some definition there. So the first question, and maybe we'll start with Jay taking it initially, and that's just, can you give us a brief overview of your background as it relates to experience in bidding and delivering cloud services? And the piece I'll throw out there is, keep in mind, we're from industry, so we don't always write the solicitations, but we do spend time reading them, that's for sure. So a lot of the context in which we'll be addressing things is that industry perspective on the government acquisition process and government solicitations. So Jay, with that.
Hello? Yes. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for GSA and the rest of the audience. My name is Jay Hajir. I started Practical Solutions about 21 years ago this month. And in it, we're focused purely on strategy, technology, engineering, and management. A lot of times when we actually were brought in is to fix something that is difficult. And rightly so, our theme through Practical Solutions is about turning chaos to order. A lot of times is we actually brought in because it is a challenging environment, and have to actually do it and step in with both deep technical engineering and technology, and even taking the management as well as the strategy. So we structure the strategy, help be a trusted partner with typically in the CIO and the management team, and then take it from basically addressing the solutions, addressing the issues, what they are, and then working through the implementations. And lately, we've been doing for the last 18 months, helping this U.S. Small Business Administration with their journey to the cloud. And it's been an interesting journey because we had to actually develop a very quick strategy that we turned it into executions, and then trying to worry about all the different multi-cloud capabilities that the Small Business Administration has, and trying to get out of the data center. There's a lot of challenges. And trying to keep the themes just purely focused on the acquisition. And acquisition of the cloud itself is also a challenge by itself, as we throw lots of terminologies and trying to figure out, well, how do I procure cloud? There's not one thing that is called a cloud. So analogies a lot of times helps, trying to figure out exactly what the difference is between infrastructure as a service, trying to platform as a service, or software as a service. And hopefully, following answers, I'll be able to actually feed you in and what our interpretation of these particular procurement is, and try and actually educate the leadership, as well as educating the procurement officers what and how to acquire the cloud. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We'll work our way this way. So Jonathan next.
Sure, thank you. So, you know, as Joe mentioned, Joe Cloud mentioned.
That's right.
You know, I spent I'm new at Veritas Technologies as CTO. I was previously an employee in the federal government. I was senior executive. I worked in a number of jobs at USDA, including the CIO for USDA. But I also worked at GSA, where I was the deputy CIO for the Federal Acquisition Service and had a number of other positions at GSA over my time here. So my perspective on this panel might be a little bit unique because I was the buyer of cloud services like many of you are. And having spent time in GSA, was very cloud focused when I was here. And I returned to USDA, worked there twice. We were beginning to adopt cloud in a lot of ways as well. The last job that I had at USDA was as the deputy senior procurement executive. So I've worked in the procurement field deeply too. So I have a lot of experience buying cloud now on the industry side. And I had been in the industry before, but it was much more management consulting and, you know, sort of pre-cloud, but a lot of looking at RFPs and such. I think now we see that cloud is much more of an expectation as part of a solicitation, and in that it almost has become, I don't want to say dumbed down because it's still very complicated, but it's like, oh, of course we're going to use the cloud. Well, it's so much more complicated than that, and I think as Jay was saying, you know, cloud's not just one thing; it's a lot of things. And as buyers, we need to be really thoughtful about the questions that are asked of vendors in, you know, pre-solicitation, and, you know, and questions that come up during source selection panels and other things, because it's much more complicated, I think, than, I don't know if something just, you know, broke there with the.
That's not your cue to cut it off. You've got an
but
additional 3 seconds.
Because it's just much more complicated. And I'm hopeful that during this conversation today, we can highlight some of those areas that make cloud hard to buy, where it's not clear why you know, a certain solution works a certain way, or how something is priced, or how prices might escalate over time, or what are the drivers of that price. As buyers, I think you're really required to know those things, and the folks that you're supporting and programs in IT need to know those too, because it gives you great opportunity to control cost and have longer term buying power. So those are some things that I'd like to talk about as we have our conversation this morning. It's great to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Great, thanks. And Shannon.
Hi, I'm Shannon Silverstein from Cloudera Government Solutions. I've been supporting the government for about 20 years. So as I look at this cloud transformation and digital transformation, I think back of when I started, and I think of, anyone remember Y2K? Yeah. So it's similar. It's a fear and uncertainty of what's going to happen in the future with data, and what your environment's going to look like, and what it's even going to look like, you know, 10 years from now, as the technology advancement between now and 20 years ago is astonishing. The data that has aggregated in your agencies over the last 20 years, some people taking it off of the manila folder and the yeah, with the rims of color-coded highlighting, which is where you knew how to file things. That's how long I've been supporting government. But so the, you know, what it is though is this whole evolution of how to transform to the cloud, what's best for your organization, it is a scary factor. Some of these data centers are closing, and everybody's thinking, oh, we have to get right into the cloud. How are we going to go do it? Or let's just go put everything in. And I think, you know, Susie made a good point earlier, is don't put everything in. Take this time, make good decisions on what needs to go in, what's going to make your agency more efficient and effective in the coming years. And as the technology changes, how are you going to remain consistent with technology and the adaptation rate that your agency has to evolve to?
Great, thank you. So the title of our panel is Your Agency is Moving to the Cloud, and then there's more of it. So we're sort of starting from the perspective of the decision's been made, but often at times I think the drivers for moving to the cloud are different, and based on what those drivers are, the type of solicitation or exactly what's being sought can vary a lot. So I wanted to have each of our panelists then, and we'll start, Shannon, with you, since I think, oh, you already handed off the microphone, but I was going to say because you had the microphone. And specifically, so what have you seen as the primary drivers for adoption of cloud from the agencies that you're working with? And then, accordingly, how easy does that make it to move into the cloud?
Well, and I, by the way, the company I work for is Cloudera. It is not a cloud company. We got that name over back 10 years ago when we started. We're an open source platform, data platform, and so we're about the data. So I bring a little bit of a different perspective to this panel where we are about the data. What do you want to do with the data? And that's the things you have to be thinking about across your organization is what do you want the data to do when it's in the cloud? It's a lot easier for when people say, you know, the biggest thing I've seen, I support the law enforcement portfolio, DHS and DOJ, you know, that they're being told their data centers are closing, and you know, I have some organizations who can't put all their data in the cloud, and what does that look like? So you have to assess your data, assess the legalities of the data, the PII, the personal information that goes along with the data, and what do you want to take to the cloud with you? And oftentimes it's going to be, as we talked a lot about it earlier, it's going to be a hybrid environment, and so then how do you centrally manage that? So I think the push to the cloud is a good one. The technology will help adapt and evolve over time. I think don't be scared by it, but also you need to do an assessment of your data. Don't bring everything to the cloud that is on your existing, you know, in your existing infrastructure today, from tools and technologies to the data assets that you have. You need to make sure that you're bringing the right things to the cloud when you go. And just because the data center's closing doesn't mean that you have to, you know, run scared and put it all into the cloud as quick as you can to check the box off. So just think through the strategy.
That's a great point. Checking the box is usually not the right answer. And so, Jonathan,
yeah, I just want to build on
to
some of Shannon's points because I think they were good. You know, I think what Shannon you're describing is a strategy for data management, right? You know, managing your data, which you need to do whether you sit in an on-premise data center or you're in the cloud. You need to know where your data is. We heard that on the last panel several times. And once you understand what your data is, you have a much better foundation from which to build a migration plan to the cloud, right? And whether it's PII or it's just data rot, data that's redundant, obsolete, or trivial, you don't need to necessarily take all the copies of that old or dark data to a cloud environment. That's really going to drive up your cost. You know, cloud is priced sort of as you use it, and it sounds, well, that's great. I'm only going to pay for what I use. Well, oftentimes we use a lot more storage than we think we use. Oftentimes we have a lot more data flowing over the lines than we think we do because we don't understand what data we have in our environments. So, you know, the title of the panel is You've Decided to Move to the Cloud. You know, I'd not take issue with the title, but I think everyone's made some investment in the cloud at this point. You know, I think that we're sort of overcome that. It's now that we're embracing this in the government as a foundational technology. How do we use it in the best way possible? How do we use it in the most cost-effective way possible? And you're all are buyers of this, so that's really something that I think you'd all care about. As the users within your agencies, programs, and IT organizations, they care too because, you know, they want to fund innovation and other modernization activities. And when infrastructure, and I think we think of cloud as infrastructure-related costs, as those costs, you know, maybe don't necessarily go down or they don't go down as much because we're using it in a way that's not as cost effective because we have too much data that we've moved that we haven't, you know, we haven't taken the necessary upfront work because we're in such a rush to create a good understanding about what data we need to operate our organizations on. those things really end up costing a lot more. I've worked with a lot of customers, and we were doing this when I worked at USDA, as we think about moving to Office 365 or other cloud email solutions, really understanding how much data you're going to migrate from your existing email system to another, or from file shares to SharePoint or some other kind of online storage. Just really important. The expectation is, well, it's unlimited storage. Well, it might be unlimited storage, but that's what you have access to, but it's not that that unlimited storage is free. Storage costs money. Everyone's going to charge you for it. It's going to be based on how much you use. So use what you need and not more than that as you make this journey. I think, Shannon, you made some really good points.
Jay?
Yes. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Shannon. I would like to take a different angle of how we interpret this from a strategy perspective, as over the past 18 months working with Mario, the CIO, and the leadership at SBA, giving me an insights more how the challenges of procurements are. There's a bridge between procurement officers, contracting officers, the CIOs, and the deputy CIO and the CTO trying to actually translate that into a procurement. And a lot of times instead of working on the terminologies, the data, and everything else, I'm trying to actually simplify it. By doing the simplification is basically saying, what are we trying to buy? At the end of the day, cloud is not such thing that you just go to the store and says, I want a cloud, I bought the cloud. It is about the drivers behind that. And the drivers, a lot of times, it's not clear. Modernization, that's a very ambiguous terms, very broad. In the essence, you can put a lot of things in it, and it's not something that you can just say, well, I'm just going to go modernization, acquisition. So I'll take the analogy of everybody knows when you move into a house, there's a kitchen. Yeah, it's anticipated to actually have a working kitchen. You need water, electricity, you need an oven. And before you start any meals, you need a working kitchen. Obviously, there's a cook involved in that. For you to do a meal, you got to have stuff that you got to cook with. Whether it is you buying the groceries, whether you're buying the meats and dairy and everything else, is what I call on-prem solutions. You have to create a meal. You got to have all of these things placed before you can actually have an actual meal, depending who you're serving. If you're just doing a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you got yourself a meal. But reality gets more complex. As the complexities in that on-prem data center, and this is the kitchen, a lot of ingredients gets washed, and you're trying to come up with the right solutions or the right procurement, and you're struggling with it. And so especially if you got different kitchens in a house, a large house, you have to actually keep different data center, the upstairs kitchen, the lower stairs kitchen, and trying to make sure you got enough groceries and cooks and everything else. The complexities from a contracting officers, it becomes complex. And to simplify it is basically, we understand how to buy hardware. We understand how to actually buy software. It's something that you can just get on and procure it. You can compete it. It's easily to compete that. If you're trying to buy, in this case, like email as a service, obviously, GSA Schedule 70 has a cloud service provider, a SIN that you can actually purchase on that. But there's more to it than that. So if we're trying to actually purchase, in this case, hardware and software to go into our data center, it's easy. We just want to make sure it's there. However, if you put in a lot of groceries in the freezer and never get to it for 6 months and you're trying to take it out, after a while it's stale. I don't know if you want to be able to use that. So you need actually something that keeps fresh. And you keep buying more stuff. And you don't just only buy it for one meal for the day. You buy it and you store it. And a lot of times you don't end up not using it. So infrastructure as a service is if you actually go to a buffet, like in Las Vegas, when you actually have all kinds of things that's already prepared for you. This is your marketplace that you purchase. So you want to be able to create a meal for your kid, or you want to be able to get a steak. Everything's there for you. How you buy it becomes basically a choice. It depends on the meal that you're trying to actually serve and who you're serving it to. So infrastructure as a service is that buffet. You're going to pay for what you consume. At the end of the day, when you walk away from that infrastructure as a service, you don't take anything back except your data in this case. Having cross-cloud capabilities Sometimes you want to try the buffet here, sometimes you want a different buffet. So, and that's the contracting officer challenge. It says, if I buy into like Amazon, or if I buy into Azure or Salesforce, how am I going to commit the money across all these things? Do I have to compete that for every single activity and then call that for the drivers of it? In this case, the modernization, or trying to consolidate data center consolidations, or the migration, all of that becomes a driver, and how you compete that among these things, it becomes the challenge. So it goes back into the education. The CIOs, the technologists, having to be able to work with the contracting officers, how to put the proper strategy for the acquisition. Sometimes you can start at $0 for implementing the cloud, in this case, infrastructure as a service. And then once your strategy becomes more formed, more realized, you're going to build on it, and then your acquisition will grow. And the relationship between the technologist and the contracting officers and the CIO and in this case, the industry helping putting these strategies together will take shape. If you're trying to put millions of dollars on a contract, says I'm just going to buy like an infrastructure as a service today, you don't know what you're going to consume, what kind of stuff you're going to go into it, how many meals are you going to prepare this for, and who's going to be serving it, because you're paying this as a utility. If you don't consume it, the data is not necessarily going to go away. The other folks are going to come in and purchase that. So it's what you serve your end customer. It's about education, about the drivers between the industry, between the CIO, the decision makers, the management team, and the contracting officer. And that's a challenge of doing any kind of acquisition, regardless of what you call it from a cloud perspective.
Great. Now, the food analogy may have made folks a little bit hungry. I think there's a break after this that's a couple minutes, so you can run in and get your snack then. I just wanted to throw out, before we move on to the next prepared question, if folks do have questions that they would like to submit, please submit them online, or else we can take questions in the room. At this point, we actually, I think, have covered all the questions that we can answer that have been submitted online. And so if you submitted a question for panel 1 and you'd like it to be addressed in panel 2, please go ahead and resubmit. I wanted to tie into what Jay had just said, because he started talking about how cloud acquisitions are sort of hard, I think, for industry to respond to because of the variation in just the range of services that can be offered. Jonathan, I was wondering if you could touch specifically on what types of information need to be articulated by the government during the acquisition process to really help us understand and for the government to specify the right type of cloud offering, the right type of cloud computing environment, and the other ilities that may need to go along with that.
Sure, thank you. So, I like to think about the concept of a performance work statement, right? And what are you trying to accomplish? A statement of objectives, right? What we're trying to do at this agency is X. Saying that we need a cloud solution, I think jumps a little bit to a way of accomplishing what you want to do. And my experience is that industry has some great ideas and experiences that you don't always have within your agency or your office. And you're better off asking for their great ideas. By beginning with the idea that our agency needs to accomplish a thing. How should we do it? So I look at it as industry's opportunity to suggest the right kind of cloud solutions. I recognize it's not always that simple, and sometimes the acquisition is for a particular kind of cloud service, or it's for a software as a service that is also cloud, maybe even platform as a service where you're buying infrastructure plus operating systems and other kinds of things. And you can't be as open to industry suggestions about how to solve a problem. But that's where I'd start, in the best case scenario. I think when it's a little more defined and prescriptive, I think some of the questions that industry wants to understand revolves around data, right? What are responsibilities around data? What are requirements for protecting data, levels of security? From a government perspective, I think that goes back to what we talked about before, really understanding what kind of data you have in your agency or within a particular application, and how is that data used? Is it shared amongst other environments? Is it shared between clouds? And from an agency perspective, I'd always suggest that or a buyer perspective, that you have some forethought about how you're going to get your data out of the cloud, right? Cloud is often very easy to get your data in, hard to get your data out. And I think that there have been some procurements across government over the past few years where that became a real issue, and agencies had to either back out of approaches or, cancel projects because they didn't maintain ownership of their data. And, having clear ownership rights of the data and privacy requirements around the data, really very important. Also, to the extent that you're going to select a cloud provider today, it's not that different than selecting another set of technologies, yesterday. They work for you now, but they might not always work. There might be a better solution for your requirements because your requirements will change and there'll be new providers on the market. So you want to figure out, or you want to be thinking about, how do I move my data between these cloud environments over time? Or maybe even bring the data, back into your office because something changes, and that's what's important. So having a clear understanding about what you need the data to do, what you need relative to the data on day one, and then understanding what might occur over the future, right? And from a procurement, the what ifs sometimes become hard, but you have to think about them because those options and that flexibility is important, not just on the government side, but on the industry side too. Industry needs to be considering the fact that, because industry wants to serve the government, very well for a long period of time, you have to be thinking about flexibilities that can be conceptualized into a solution. So, just in summary, I'd say thinking about understanding the data requirements that you have, who owns it, where it needs to be, what are acceptable uses of it, privacy requirements. As the government, what do you do when you want to move your data to another environment, and how do you protect that data? Right, that data protection is very important, and it may or may not come in the way that you need it in your particular cloud solution. And going back to the very beginning of really very clearly articulating to industry, what are you trying to accomplish? And if you can be very clear about that, I think you have a good foundation for a strong procurement and good service from industry.
Great. Shannon or Jay, anything to add? And you may want to take a while because we do have some questions that are starting to come in from online, and they are hard. So, anything to add?
Yeah. Well, to second what Jonathan was saying is actually data is a very important one, but securing the data is, yes, second. But there's a lot more to it from a cloud, just the data. Especially when you're challenged at trying to actually run an organization or run a whole agency. There's a lot of pieces that needs to come together, not just the data elements of it. Maintaining the mission, availability, responsiveness, mobility, and then also drivers. The newer technology that you're trying to actually implement to improve the collaboration of your team, to try and actually have cross communications. If you're talking about citizen engagement in this case, you're talking about cross agencies relationship. Technology needs to be there. In this case, are we trying to actually standardize on a specific cloud, or are we cross cloud? When you bring data into the cloud, a lot of the CSPs, they don't charge you for it. When you're trying to get data out of the cloud, there's the ingress and egress cost. So sometimes, where your data resides, it can actually reside across clouds. In this case, whether it is in the PaaS, SaaS, or IaaS. And that's a challenge that we are actually trying to address within the SBA, because we got multi-cloud capabilities, and we says, okay, if we can actually move the data and have the data actually being almost instantaneous, having access between all these cloud providers, and try and minimize the cost. Cost is become a challenge for the procurement and contracting officers, because when they commit money at the beginning of the period of performance and it gets consumed, they have to go back and add more money. It's a consumption model. So managing that, it is a partnership between the contracting officers and the management, as well back at the industry itself. You got to look at it from our perspective is what's the strategy, what's the driver behind it, and yet can we sustain it? Keeping the lights on when nobody's there, that's a waste. That's not efficiencies. How do you actually make the cloud to be more effective to what you need to do? DevOps, for example, DevSecOps, that is not running 24/7. And there's no developers actually around the clock who will be actually doing that. A lot of unessential core infrastructure needs to also take in consideration. Sometimes you got to figure out if it is an infrastructure or a PaaS or a SaaS, what's the model? What's the contracting officer's challenges trying to keep up with all the spend and how the spend is actually across cloud. Right now, you have to actually compete every single one. So there's not say, I'm just going to purchase one cloud credit, for example, that's going to go toward across clouds. So that is not actually available today for the contracting officer to be able to utilize. So we actually worked with the GSA to come up with some kind of a solutions to allow you to make that happen. So those are challenges that the contracting officers will be faced with, and we've gone through these and trying to simplify it and actually have some kind of a strategy for it.
I just want to add one thing to that. There are some good points there. And from a buying perspective and understanding what you're buying, it's very important that we start, that you're working with your IT organizations who are all now working with OMB and I think GSA around technology business management, TBM. And TBM is this approach to understanding IT costs. It's used throughout industry. We're adopting it in government. And when you're purchasing cloud or any other service, well, what kinds of requirements do you need to put in the solicitation? So the data about what things cost and how those costs are driven by different capabilities or requirements, how do those translate into the TBM cost columns, the cost categories that we're all trying to track and manage to. So not that cloud's going to be vastly different than maybe another telecommunication service that you're buying, but I believe that there may be some language or requirements on the vendor that you need to be considering as you begin to or continue to procure cloud. I think there might be a question out there.
So let's see. Well, let Shannon. Did you have something you wanted to add before I shift
just
to
one
audience
last
questions?
thing I would say before specifying the right cloud type of cloud environment you need is to really get your security people involved in this decision as well, because there is a lot of risk around data if it's going into a commercial cloud or if it's going to a private data center. All of these have to be addressed, and getting them engaged early is a good idea. And then defining where your data governance, your audit, and lineage is gonna fall. Is that gonna be with the cloud provider, or is it gonna remain with your agency? So again, really good things to think about as you decide what cloud is right for you or what environment's gonna be right for you in the future.
Great points. I know we had one hand that went up here in the auditorium, and I wanted to cover one of the questions that came in online before we do that. I'm going to put a little bit of a different twist on it since, Jay, you already touched on it, I think. And the question is, how can cloud service providers and authorized resellers ensure that cloud usage does not exceed available funding on existing contracts? And the reason I wanted to go back to that is you sort of alluded to it, Jay, but at the end of the day, that is one of the challenges when it comes to the model. So anything to add?
Yeah, it's I actually personally get involved in this because at the early stages, cloud spend wasn't as much because the consumption wasn't there. As we increase the demand, and this is a daily exercise. It's not something that you just leave it and forget it. The assumptions that your cloud assumption, at least consumption and a specific workload, you expect it to be at a certain price, but then you figure out later that it's a combination of multiple things. So it's working with the vendor, with the CSPs, and then working with the contracting officer. Says, okay, I think we need to go back and make an adjustment to the invoice because there's something at the beginning didn't match versus what we actually seen. So it is a daily exercise, because otherwise you'll make an assumption that your cloud spend at a certain dollar amount, then you find out, wait a minute, you overspent. And overspent because of a simple change that actually happened or being deployed that wasn't taken into consideration and wasn't completely spelled out. So having that as under control is very, very key. And it's not something that you just completely ignore what we've been doing. And previously, we just buy the hardware and the software and just leave it on the shelf or use it. So it is an assumption that if you don't pay attention to it, you're going to be over budget.
Yeah. And I would say, again, those are questions that you all need to be asking as buyers. How does the vendor monitor that, and how are you alerted to usage or spikes or overages? Because I know from firsthand experience that overages occur. right? They just happen because we don't understand exactly how we're using some of these technologies at times, or the users of them don't understand the cost drivers of the technologies. So overages are going to happen. I think the question is, what can the vendor do to prevent it? And that's a question you have to ask. And or how can they alert you when you've reached a certain threshold so you can make adjustments? And this happened to me on the government side in multiple agencies. You get a bill from a vendor with an unexpected dollar amount that you have to pay because you use the service, and suddenly it impacts your plans across the enterprise to do other things. And that's the last thing you want as an operator of IT, a CIO, or program manager, when you cannot add programmatic capabilities, functionalities, and drive the mission because you have an unexpected infrastructure cost that, through better communication and planning, could have been controllable. It's really a bad situation, and unfortunately it happens, but I do believe it's preventable.
The one thing I would add, I'll switch to being a panelist for a second, is we're often used to dealing in quarterly reporting, monthly reporting. Well, if we're expecting technology to be moving at the pace of something that is an order of magnitude faster than that, then the idea of monthly reporting when it comes to invoices and expenditures isn't necessarily one that fits consumption-based models. And so I think the points, Jonathan and Jay, that you brought up really sort of fit that as well, that there's a time frame aspect for us to consider. Shannon, did you have anything to add before I shift to Jay? Go back before I shift to a question in the audience.
One more thing to actually add to this is that there's ways around it if you actually develop the strategy to be able to remedy some of these changes, so it won't necessarily impact overages, but allows you to lessons learned to prevent future overages.
Now, this is always a risk with live questions, so you got to make it an easy one, but I did see a hand shoot up over there, and do you have a microphone?
Yes, I do.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm very new to cloud technology, so the questions I have for you is, what systems, can you give examples of what systems are not appropriate for the cloud, or the type of work that would not be appropriate? And then based on that, how do you know which cloud is appropriate to buy? And then the last point I would like for you to address is, can you give a best practice example of a very clearly written solicitation for cloud technology?
Three great ones there.
Yeah. Well, let me take the first one. Maybe we could split it up that way. So what's not appropriate for cloud? So I think this was covered a little bit in the last panel, but there are legacy applications in all of our environments, and I kind of take issue with the term legacy a little bit because as soon as you put a system in production, it's kind of legacy, right? So no one's ever been able to give me a clear definition of what legacy is. But the fact of the matter is there are systems all across our environments that were built over a number of years, and they work, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't still be in our environments. They might not be the latest and greatest technologies, but they work. Oftentimes, there's an assumption that they could run in a more modern technology or in a cloud for less money. I would challenge that assumption just because things are never as cut and dry or simple as that. And especially some older applications, we might say that they are, quote unquote, not cloud ready. And by that we mean they are architected in a way that doesn't take advantage of some of the scaling capabilities of cloud, or they have challenges sending data between systems, or moving data in ways, and sometimes doing it in ways that can be very expensive. So a system that might not be cloud ready would be one that is not a good candidate. And how do you assess cloud ready? I think that there are definitely checklists that are out there. You look at U.S. Digital Service or 18F kinds of organizations and say, what are the attributes of a system that's cloud ready? Or there might be some systems that have data requirements that don't necessarily fit in the cloud because of either national security or their FISMA high systems or other kinds of things, and we don't want to take that risk yet. Although some organizations are, and sometimes there are things like a private cloud where that the DoD and the Intel community, they're using cloud for these kinds of systems, but they did it with a lot of forethought and planning inside those organizations. It's not a commercial cloud technology. So I'd look at the age of the system, because that might be an indicator, right? And what are the foundational technologies that system was built on, and what are the data requirements, privacy requirements, security requirements around the data, things like that, as starting points for wondering whether or not a system is a good candidate for the cloud.
A choice between government cloud, commercial cloud, sometimes actually will come up on a regular basis. Identifying basically the risks and the adoption of that particular environment. Even in the DoD, not everything is actually supposed to be a government or high cloud candidates. So depending on the workload, depending on the solutions, you can have multi-cloud capability where you actually have commercial and the government cloud and have that properly segregated. So you can choose whether you want to, a specific environment that is purely in the interest of the mission and the risk. So you assess it if it's going to require like a FedRAMP high versus a FedRAMP moderate or even commercial cloud capability. The other aspect that you're going to take a look at is the capabilities. A lot of times if the application takes the full capabilities like we're trying to do with the chatbots or we're trying to do with the machine learning capability, a lot of these capabilities and features not necessarily yet available or to be available later on down from a specific cloud provider in the high environment. So we chose specifically working with a lot of the engineers, a lot of the management leadership, in the case for SBA, to move an environment from the high environment, cloud environment, infrastructure, and actually push it down to the actual commercial cloud. And that is a FedRAMP moderate. And a lot of the workloads within the SBA was specifically tailored to the moderate environment. So at some point, we actually had both the high as well as the moderate environment running. And sometimes we take a risk in a lot of the applications in the platforms to utilize Yammer. That is not necessarily a FedRAMP environment, but accepting that risk becomes the responsibility for the leadership and the CIO to assume. And as Maria will always say, it's, as long as she says that she doesn't look good in orange jumpsuit, so we're trying to keep out of that. So how to acquire that? It would be it's a management team between really the leadership and having the synergies between the industry, between the cloud provider, the procurement officers, the management, and the CIO to be able to actually make those decisions and moving forward on this. And I think cost is a driver a lot of times. You know, having put a workload in the high environment, it's very costly versus the moderate, and the consumption of it. And then there are some workloads completely it's not going to fit in any of these environments, especially if it's an older legacy, like in Solaris environments, you know, or to be able to specific a workload that just doesn't have a fit within the cloud, so it stays on-prem. And this is when you start becoming actually more of a hybrid between multi-cloud as well as an on-prem solution.
So I've got another hard one that came in online. And we've touched on cost savings a little bit. The question specifically is around the idea that with a relatively small number of cloud service providers out there, there's a pretty developed ecosystem of resellers and managed services partners and others that are essentially brokering those cloud services. The question had to do with economies of scale and how can an agency think about having both competition across numerous providers, knowing that there's a relatively small number of cloud service providers, but at the same time get those economies of scale. So they're trying to both split up acquisitions and then at the same time realize the economies of scale. So I realize that might be a very tough question to answer, but I think there's a corollary to it as well that I was hoping we could touch on, which is, so what's the best approach? Is it better for the agency to consolidate buy when it comes to the infrastructure and maybe separate out some other services, or try to keep the acquisition of those cloud services pegged to a given application or something along those lines? Any thoughts from the panel there?
I'll offer in the beginning that the idea of an organization doing everything together sounds great, but it's very hard to accomplish, especially in a large federated agency. And but all agencies are different. Some are centralized already, even if they're large. Some are smaller, but have a lot of pockets of buying. And to buy all at once and to buy in an enterprise way requires change management. It requires the hearts and minds of the people that are making those procurements and running the different IT organizations across a very large, complicated organization to want to do it. So you can get there, and I think you can buy a large agency, a DHS or a HHS kind of organization could conceptually buy all together, but you need all these very large and complicated organizations within those large complicated organizations to want to do that. So if you have the environment that supports people coming together, I'd say, yeah, go for it and see how you can come up with corporate solutions. But if you look at recently in the DoD and the JEDI procurement and the idea of moving to a single provider, which was the plan, that met a lot of resistance at different levels of government and industry. So it's easily said, it's hard to do, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try hard things and at least contemplate how we can make them work in our environment. But change management is really important.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would say that a couple things to think about too is that when you go to, I don't think any organization that's large in capacity would agree all in to one way or another. I mean, that's just the reality and the nature of the organizations and the policies and the politics that go around that. I think that it's important to have options, and there are options out there. I mean, you have your public commercial cloud providers. You've got your, you can do an on-prem cloud an on-prem cloud solution that might. It's just going to depend on what is going to fit within your organization, your specific needs, and be able to address them. And I don't know if all in one is going to ever be an option, but I think that's why we talk a lot about multi-cloud environments and hybrid environments, because I think that's the reality of all the data assets that we have and all the applications that we're running and all the legacy applications that are running. You don't want to just put that all in one.
The challenge, I mean, for having multi-cloud procurement is as strategies change. In this case, if you put all your eggs in one basket, let's say whether it's Amazon or Microsoft or Salesforce, moving, with the speed of, dynamic decision making is very difficult, because then you put yourself back when we're doing procurement as hardware or software. So we're trying to be agnostics in this case, because I'm trying to actually help the mission. So trying to figure out, okay, what makes sense? Do we have a single bucket of money that we can actually spread across these cloud providers? How easy it is to actually move funding between those particular cloud providers? It's from our challenge, it's very difficult. Once the money is actually committed at a period of performance in a specific cloud, with the procurement challenges, it's very difficult moving that money between one provider and the next. Mm-hmm. And so there's a consumption model. So actually it's a utility. At the end of the day, some of it is actually challenged that you run out of the period of performance and you still got money left on the contract. And a lot of times that period of performance ends and all that committed money goes away. So, and the fact if you do licensing, in this case, if it's SaaS solutions, and so you have to actually commit, and as a strategy and adoptions takes a while. So if you start with 3,000 users for a specific SaaS environment seats, then you end up having to have only 5 or 10 users consume that. That's money left on the table for the government that can never get it back. So, I mean, GSA, from a procurement schedule, GSA has the Schedule 70 or the CSP CLIN 132-40. Allows you to be able to procure these cloud service providers. One of the things is say, what's the best way to procure that and allow for the multi-cloud spend, and ability to move funding between cloud is a key for this to succeed. Otherwise, you're going to end up really committing a lot of money in a single provider, and you have no way to move that, especially if your strategy changed and the decisions to actually shift between cloud becomes a key. So if you find out that a workload is better in an Amazon cloud versus Azure cloud, you can't switch that workload. You're pretty much committed to it.
And the fact of the matter is that cloud is somebody else's data center, effectively, right? It's going to go down. All clouds go down, and Amazon has gone down in the past, and Microsoft has gone down in the past, and Salesforce has gone down. These are outages because it's technology. It's just like outages in your agency today. Maybe they're less frequent, but they're outages. I think Amazon, AWS is like 99.9% uptime or something like that, if I recall. I mean, that's about 72 hours of programmed in downtime per year. Right? Don't quote me on that. That's not necessarily what they say, but it works out to something like that. And it's just a reality of technology. Things break. So, there's a concept, business continuity is an important concept in all of our environments presently. And business continuity in the age of multi-cloud in some ways is actually a little bit easier if you have technologies that you procure with your, cloud initiatives that allow you to fail over to another cloud environment or run in a multi-cloud environment as Jay's describing. Because you'll have an outage, and when that outage happens, AWS or another provider, Microsoft or Google, whoever it is, their service level agreement is around getting their infrastructure as a service back up in a timely manner, and they're very good at that. But if you read the fine print, often you're responsible for your data, you're responsible for your systems, you're responsible for the security of those systems. It's not on the provider per se. And the reality is when something goes down, if it's not a well-architected application or there are a lot of dependencies, sometimes it can be very hard to bring that application back up. Sometimes data could get corrupted. So you need data protection when you're in the cloud. You need business continuity when you're in the cloud. The same requirements that you have today in your agencies when you operate IT and that you need to buy when you're buying technology apply if you're buying data center services effectively, cloud services, compute services in the cloud from another vendor. They're not going to do all those things for you. It might feel like they're doing some things for you because that's the way it sounds or it's sold, but that's where you got to really read the fine print and ask a lot of questions in my opinion.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think we have one question of someone that's been shooting their hand up in the audience for a bit, so let's try to get that one in. We've got only a couple more minutes left. Go right ahead.
Thank you. I think Shannon mentioned that we have to move the right things to the cloud, and I would like to know the specific examples of the right things and how these right things are secured in the cloud environment.
So the question, it sounds like, is specific to cloud security for specific documents that may be moving into a public cloud environment? Is that
And how they are secured in the cloud environment.
Yeah, so those are going to have to be, open discussions with the cloud provider that you're talking to, and again, it goes back to the open communication is what are you looking for as an organization, and again, to have those security staff, your security officers in the room that actually are going to help you to ATO and all of those things along the way, is the sooner you get them involved. My point was that, the happier everyone will be, and the checks and balances will be there as you go down that path. From a security perspective, right, you have to figure out, again, it's going to have to be an open conversation with the service provider that you're talking to, is how are they securing your data, who owns the key management aspect of that, are you supposed to be in control of that? And some of the organizations have very sensitive data, and they want to, obviously hold on to the key management structure so they can own it and not have the commercial cloud vendor own that aspect of it. And then the security around audit and lineage, who's accessing the data, when you need to figure out how you're going to implement that and how you're going to do that, and when it's not in your data center anymore, it's in a commercial cloud.
So we're about out of time. I wanted to just have a real quick lightning round if we can. So this, no pressure, maybe 15 words or less. We'll see how we do. In terms of just what final thoughts do you want to leave with our attendees today in terms of how to make a lot more agile and sort of future-proof acquisitions so that 10 years from now, we're not thinking about the challenges backwards looking that we had 10 years ago when it comes to how solicitations looked and how to sort of future-proof those requirements. Anyone want to tackle that one?
I would get all your components together. and start to define your future goals as an organization and what that might look like, how much data consumption is going to be in the future based on historical numbers. Data, I mean, the sensor information coming in from all over the place is going to be crippling in the next 5 years. So account for that. Account for if a cloud service provider starts to raise the rates on you and you can no longer afford that, how are you going to move and transition your data over to something else? So just be cautious of, again, where you're going to put your data assets, how your data assets are going to grow, and how your personnel, how are they going to be able to access this data in the future? Mobile devices, I mean, everything that, are they going to be remote work from home or in the office, and how are they going to access this data? And is that all going to make sense with the future roadmap? So map it out. Don't go into this quickly or hastily. Just make sure you define all of these requirements and set the stage.
I knew lightning round wouldn't be easy.
Yeah, that was like lightning and thunder, then a little more lightning.
That's right.
But real quick, cloud, everything Shannon said, plus cloud is a very important tool in your toolbox. Software as a service, infrastructure as a service, all these things have the opportunity to change the way organizations buy technology. And we're effectively outsourcing a lot more things than we used to do. We did internally. So one day, long in the future, it's all going to be about the data Shannon was just talking about. And most technology will, infrastructure kinds of things and applications even through, the Salesforces and Microsofts and others will be in the cloud largely. And you, as leaders in your agencies, need to have strong control over your data, understand it, be able to use it, know where it is, know how to move it around, pull it back when you need it, move it across multiple clouds, because when it comes time to use that data to achieve great outcomes in your agency, it doesn't matter where it is. The people that want it when they want it, where they want it, how they want it, and it's up to you to enable your IT organizations through acquisitions to be able to have tools to move that data around, own it, and have mastery over it. That's the long-term thinking, long-term strategy that I think will achieve success across not just government and not just federal government, but across IT.
I'll keep it very fast. Agile acquisition is a key. It's a terminology that will be here, and a lot of the contracting officers out there are trying to figure out how to do agile acquisition. And I would say start with GSA schedule. I think there's a good opportunity for you to leverage. But situational awareness, agile acquisition.
Great, thank you. So thank you to all of our outstanding panelists and for the great questions that came in online.